At 21, doctors told Stephen Hawking he had no more than 2 years to live. Over the next 5 decades, his body shut down piece by piece. He lost the ability to walk, then to speak, then to move a single finger. Most people believe his success came from extraordinary genius. That belief is wrong. It wasn't luck. It was endurance, ruthless mental discipline, and a decision to keep thinking when everything else stopped. This is how a terminal diagnosis turned into a mind that reshaped time, space, and the universe itself. The diagnosis came quietly. No dramatic room. No countdown clock on the wall. Just a doctor explaining that the tremors were not stress, not fatigue, not temporary. It was ALS. A progressive disease. No cure. No reversal. Life expectancy, 2 years, maybe less. Stephen Hawking was 21. At first, he did nothing. Friends noticed the change before he did. He stopped caring about deadlines. Missed lectures. Drifted through Cambridge like someone already half gone. When you're told your future has been erased, ambition feels pointless. Why plan a life you won't live long enough to finish? Then the symptoms accelerated. He fell more often. Words began to slur. Simple tasks took longer. The body he had never paid much attention to suddenly demanded all of it. Every step became a calculation. Every sentence a risk. Every morning carried the question of what would fail next. And then came the stillness. Hawking later described a moment where time seemed to pause. Not out of fear, but clarity. If his life was going to be short, there was no reason to waste it on small problems. No reason to chase safe ideas. No reason to delay the hardest questions. He stopped worrying about his future body and redirected everything into his mind. While his muscles weakened, his thinking sharpened. While his speech slowed, his questions became bolder. While others planned careers, he raced against extinction itself. That was the pivot most people never see. The disease did not inspire him. It cornered him. And in that corner, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. If time was running out, then he would spend it only on ideas big enough to survive him. Stephen Hawking was born in January 1942, in Oxford, during a winter when Britain was still counting the cost of war. His arrival came almost exactly 300 years after the death of Galileo. The coincidence would later become legend, but his childhood was anything but mythical. It was ordinary, restrained, and shaped by quiet discipline rather than grand ambition. His family valued intellect, not comfort. Money was limited. The house was cluttered with books and unfinished projects. Dinner conversations drifted toward ideas, not emotions. Curiosity was encouraged, but excellence was never demanded outright. Hawking grew up learning that thinking mattered more than appearance, and persistence mattered more than polish. At school, he was not immediately exceptional. Teachers saw potential but no urgency. Classmates nicknamed him Einstein, half mockingly, half curiously, long before he earned anything close to the comparison. He preferred arguments to routines, questions to instructions. He often skipped steps, jumped conclusions, and trusted intuition over method. It made him unpredictable, and sometimes underestimated. Socially, he hovered at the edges. He was not isolated, but he was different. Competitive games bored him. Small talk exhausted him. What pulled him in were puzzles, mechanical systems, and debates that could stretch for hours. He learned early to live inside his head, where complexity felt safe and controllable. University life at Oxford sharpened that instinct. He studied physics with minimal effort, relying on raw intelligence rather than discipline. He rarely took notes, rarely revised, rarely worried. He passed exams comfortably, not because he worked harder than others, but because thinking came easily, almost too easily. Structure felt unnecessary. Consequences felt distant. That lack of urgency would matter later. When he moved to Cambridge for graduate work, the problems grew larger, more abstract. Cosmology was not a fashionable field. Many considered it speculative, even unserious. Hawking gravitated toward it anyway. Big questions attracted him. Origins. Time. The edges of what could be known. But even then, his body had begun to whisper warnings. Small stumbles. A dropped cup. A slurred word after a long day. He ignored them. Everyone did. Youth has a way of dismissing signals it doesn't want to hear. There were theories. Stress. Clumsiness. Fatigue. Nothing worth slowing down for. Looking back, those early years read differently. The messy house. The inward focus. The habit of living in thought rather than action. None of it predicted ALS. But all of it prepared him for a life where thinking would be the last thing left. Before the diagnosis, Hawking believed time was abundant. After it, time became the only thing that mattered. And that shift, from casual brilliance to deliberate thinking, would define everything that came next. When Stephen Hawking began his doctoral work at Cambridge, nothing about his career looked inevitable. Cosmology sat on the margins of physics. Many senior scientists viewed it as philosophical speculation rather than serious science. If Hawking wanted safety, recognition, or a fast track, he had chosen the wrong field. But safety no longer mattered. After the diagnosis, time stopped feeling abstract. Every calculation carried weight. Every paper felt like a race. He could no longer afford incremental progress or cautious thinking. If he was going to contribute anything, it had to be something fundamental. His early work focused on the origin of the universe and the nature of singularities. These were not fashionable topics. They were mathematically brutal and conceptually dangerous. Mistakes were easy. Acceptance was rare. And his physical condition was deteriorating fast. He began using a cane. Then too, walking became awkward and exhausting. Lectures required more effort than research. Colleagues noticed his mind was accelerating as his body slowed. While others refined existing theories, Hawking attacked first principles. Rejection followed. Papers were questioned. Ideas were challenged aggressively. Some critics doubted whether someone with his condition could sustain a serious research career. Others simply dismissed cosmology itself as a dead end. At the same time, practical life became harder. Writing took longer. Traveling to conferences became a logistical problem. Speaking clearly was no longer guaranteed. Every professional step required more energy than before, and that energy was running out. There were moments when quitting seemed reasonable. A quiet academic life. Limited output. Lower expectations. No one would have blamed him. Instead, he narrowed his focus even further. Hawking made a ruthless decision. He would only work on problems that mattered at the deepest level. No side projects. No safe publications. No distractions. If his time was limited, then every thought had to count. This approach isolated him. It also sharpened him. As his physical independence faded, his intellectual independence hardened. He learned to hold entire arguments in his head, manipulating equations mentally when writing became too slow. He trained himself to think without movement, without notes, without comfort. What looked like limitation from the outside became concentration on the inside. By the time his condition forced him into a wheelchair, Hawking was no longer just a struggling graduate student. He was becoming something far more dangerous to the status quo. A thinker with nothing left to lose. By the early 1970s, Stephen Hawking was no longer working in obscurity. His ideas were beginning to collide with the foundations of physics itself. Alongside Roger Penrose, he proved that singularities were not mathematical quirks. They were unavoidable. According to Einstein's equations, the universe began with one. That result changed the rules. Cosmology could no longer be dismissed as speculation. It was anchored in hard mathematics. And Hawking was at the center of it. Then came the idea that made him impossible to ignore. Black holes were supposed to be eternal prisons. Nothing escaped. Not light. Not information. But Hawking asked a question no one else had pushed far enough. What happens when quantum mechanics meets gravity at the edge of a black hole? The answer shocked the field. Black holes were not completely black. They leaked energy. Slowly. Inevitably. This became known as Hawking radiation. It was radical, controversial, and devastatingly elegant. The idea suggested that black holes could evaporate over time. That the most extreme objects in the universe were not permanent. That even gravity had limits. The scientific reaction was immediate and divided. Some called it brilliant. Others called it impossible. But everyone paid attention. As his body continued to fail, his reputation surged. He was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, a chair once held by Isaac Newton. Media attention followed. Interviews. Lectures. Public fascination with the man who seemed to think faster as he physically slowed. Outwardly, it looked like triumph. Inwardly, the cost was rising. His speech became increasingly difficult to understand. Eating took hours. Travel required assistance. Fame did not slow the disease. It amplified the strain. Schedules tightened. Expectations grew. The world wanted access to his mind, while his body demanded more care than ever. And yet, he pushed further. When A Brief History of Time was published, it shattered expectations. A dense book about cosmology became a global bestseller, selling millions of copies. People who had never taken a physics class bought it, struggled through it, and kept it anyway. The book turned Hawking into something rare, a scientist known by name. But behind the applause, something darker was forming. Success had expanded his reach. It had not expanded his strength. And the more visible he became, the harder it was to hide the reality that his body was approaching a point of no return. By the mid-1980s, the balance finally broke. For years, Stephen Hawking had lived in a narrow space where decline was slow enough to outrun. That space disappeared after a severe bout of pneumonia. He was rushed into intensive care. Doctors faced a decision that carried a quiet finality. A tracheotomy would save his life, but it would almost certainly take his voice forever. The operation succeeded. Hawking lived. But when he woke, the sound that had carried his thoughts into the world was gone. For the first time since the diagnosis, he could not speak at all. The silence was not symbolic. It was absolute. No lectures. No arguments. No casual exchanges. Even basic needs had to be guessed or written out, letter by letter, at a pace that made conversation feel impossible. The mind that had challenged black holes was trapped behind a body that could no longer perform the most basic human function. This was not a setback. It was a severing. Publicly, Hawking remained a figure of admiration. Privately, the days grew heavier. Communication required patience from everyone around him. Some had it. Some did not. Meetings slowed. Interviews became exhausting. The gap between how fast he thought and how slowly he could respond widened into frustration. Dependence deepened. Eating required help. Washing required help. Moving required help. Independence, once taken for granted, vanished completely. For someone whose identity was built on intellectual control, the loss cut deeper than physical pain. The emotional toll followed. There were stretches of withdrawal. Long silences where he conserved energy rather than engage. Moments where effort felt pointless. The world celebrated his resilience, but resilience is not a constant state. It breaks. It reforms. It breaks again. At home, strain crept into personal relationships. Care became routine. Romance became complicated. Illness has a way of reorganizing power inside a marriage, and not always gently. The disease did not pause for success or recognition. It progressed with indifference. Professionally, expectations only increased. Fame had multiplied demands. Conferences wanted him present. Media wanted him visible. Institutions wanted his name attached. The image of the brilliant, unbreakable mind in the wheelchair became iconic. But icons are not allowed to collapse. The pressure to perform never aligned with the reality of his condition. Pain was constant. Fatigue was relentless. Each public appearance required calculation. How long could he sit upright? How much energy could he afford to spend today without borrowing from tomorrow? Inside, another fear surfaced. Not death. Obsolescence. Physics does not wait. Younger minds arrive. New methods appear. Without a voice, without speed, without physical stamina, Hawking risked becoming a symbol rather than a participant. A respected figurehead instead of an active thinker. That fear mattered more than the disease itself. What saved him was not optimism. It was adaptation. Technology stepped in where biology failed. A computer system allowed him to select words, first with his hand, later with minimal muscle control. The process was painfully slow. But it returned something essential: agency. Thought could once again become language. Even so, the cost was isolation. Conversations became deliberate. Spontaneity vanished. Humor survived, but timing did not. The world moved faster than his interface could follow. And yet, inside that narrow channel, something unexpected happened. Forced slowness sharpened clarity. With fewer words available, each one mattered more. With fewer interactions, attention turned inward. Problems were held longer, turned over more carefully, reduced to their core. The body was winning. There was no denying that. But the mind was not retreating. It was reorganizing. This was the darkest stretch. Not because death felt near, but because life felt smaller. Reduced to essentials. Stripped of convenience. Stripped of illusion. And it raised a brutal question that no equation could answer. What is a mind worth when everything else is gone? After the silence came survival mode. Communication was no longer natural. It was engineered. Every sentence passed through layers of delay, choice, confirmation, patience. The world learned to wait for Stephen Hawking. And Hawking learned something harsher. Waiting changes how people treat you. Some leaned in. Others drifted away. The isolation wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. Jokes landed late or not at all. In rooms full of people, he could still feel alone. Fame kept him visible, but visibility is not connection. Inside his head, the pressure intensified. Thinking had always been fast. Now output was slow. The gap became a daily frustration. Ideas arrived fully formed and had to queue, sometimes for hours, to exit. By the time a thought was spoken, the room had often moved on. That friction reshaped his work. Hawking began to simplify. Not his ambition, but his expression. He focused on problems that could survive long stretches of internal reasoning without constant back and forth. He leaned into intuition, visualization, and mental modeling. Mathematics became something he carried, not something he wrote. At the same time, the public image hardened into a myth. The wheelchair. The computer voice. The genius who overcame disability. It was flattering and misleading. Overcoming implies victory. ALS never stopped advancing. There was no triumph over the disease. Only coexistence. The myth became another burden. People projected strength onto him and expected consistency. But consistency is expensive when every day costs more than the last. There were days when fatigue erased productivity. Days when pain narrowed attention. Days when thinking itself felt heavy. And still, the fear of irrelevance returned. Hawking understood something most people never face directly. If you stop producing, the world does not pause. It replaces you. That knowledge fueled him more than inspiration ever could. He did not work to feel fulfilled. He worked to remain present. That drive led him into deeper questions, about information, time, and the fate of the universe itself. Questions large enough to justify the effort it took to answer them. Questions that could hold his attention through physical decline. Slowly, a new equilibrium formed. Life became smaller but sharper. Fewer interactions. Fewer comforts. Fewer distractions. In that narrowed space, focus intensified. The disease had stripped away choice. What remained was intention. Hawking did not romanticize his condition. He did not claim it made him better. He acknowledged what it took, and what it took away. The cost was real. Permanent. Non-negotiable. But within those constraints, he discovered a truth that would shape the rest of his life. Freedom is not the absence of limits. It is deciding what matters inside them. The body had taken almost everything. The mind adapted, not by fighting back, but by refusing to shrink. And that refusal, quiet, persistent, unspectacular, became the foundation for what came next. The turning point did not arrive as a sudden revelation. There was no dramatic speech. No declaration of renewal. For Stephen Hawking, change came through acceptance, quiet, disciplined, and irreversible. Once communication stabilized, something fundamental shifted. The fear of disappearing eased. Not because his condition improved, but because his ability to participate returned. Slowly. Imperfectly. Enough. He stopped measuring his life against what he had lost and began organizing it around what still functioned. Energy became currency. Every task was evaluated. Every commitment questioned. If something did not serve thinking, it was cut. This was not surrender. It was strategy. Hawking simplified his world so his mind could stay complex. His schedule narrowed. His research sharpened. He avoided problems that required constant collaboration or rapid iteration. Instead, he chose questions that rewarded long, solitary concentration. Questions that could live inside his head for weeks. That decision reshaped his output. He became more selective, not less ambitious. Fewer papers. Bigger ideas. He focused on the deepest conflicts in modern physics, information loss, the nature of time, the limits of prediction. Problems that did not care how fast you typed or how loudly you spoke. At the same time, he embraced public communication in a new way. If his voice had to be synthetic, then he would use it deliberately. Slowly delivered sentences forced listeners to pay attention. What once felt like a limitation became authority. Silence before speech added weight. His lectures became events. Not because of spectacle, but because of patience. People listened differently. Thought differently. The pace changed. Personally, he made another hard adjustment, asking for help without apology. Independence was redefined. Control no longer meant doing everything himself. It meant directing attention, deciding priorities, and protecting the one asset that still expanded, his thinking. This was the real rebirth. Not physical recovery. Not emotional catharsis. But a recalibration of what a life could be. Hawking stopped trying to outrun decline. He learned to work inside it. And in doing so, he extended his influence far beyond what his early prognosis ever allowed. The disease set the limits. He decided how to move within them. And once that balance was found, the years that followed were not about survival anymore. They were about legacy. In the decades that followed, life settled into a rhythm shaped by limits and intention. The disease continued its steady advance. There was no plateau, no remission, no relief. But stability emerged in another form, clarity. Each year that passed was not borrowed time anymore. It was chosen time. Stephen Hawking remained intellectually active far longer than anyone expected. He continued publishing, debating, and refining ideas about black holes, information, and the fate of the universe. His work evolved with the field. He challenged younger physicists, revised his own positions, and publicly admitted when he believed he had been wrong. In a discipline built on certainty, that openness became part of his authority. Outside academia, his influence expanded beyond physics. He became a global symbol not of brilliance alone, but of sustained engagement. His appearances were measured. His words were deliberate. When he spoke about time, humanity listened. When he warned about artificial intelligence, climate change, or the fragility of civilization, it carried unusual weight. This was not a pundit speaking. It was someone who understood limits intimately. Education became a central pillar of his legacy. Through books, lectures, and media, he translated abstract ideas into something the public could wrestle with. Millions bought his work not because they understood every page, but because they trusted the mind behind it. Curiosity, not comprehension, was the gateway he opened. For people living with disability, his impact was quieter but deeper. He never claimed to be a role model. He never offered slogans. He simply continued. Year after year. In full view of decline. That persistence reframed what contribution could look like when the body fails but purpose remains. Toward the end of his life, the focus narrowed further. Fewer projects. Fewer appearances. More reflection. He spoke openly about the randomness of existence and the responsibility that comes with intelligence. Not optimism. Responsibility. When he died in 2018, the reaction was global. Scientists mourned a peer. Students mourned a teacher. The public mourned a voice that had slowed them down long enough to think about where they were going. What he left behind was not a solution to the universe. It was a standard. A life that did not expand outward through power or comfort, but inward through focus. A reminder that meaning does not require symmetry, speed, or strength. Only commitment to something larger than fear. Stephen Hawking's life was never about defeating illness. ALS was not an obstacle he overcame. It was a condition he lived inside. What mattered was not that his body failed, but that his purpose did not shrink with it. He lost movement. He lost speech. He lost independence. What he kept was direction. At some point, the story stops being about physics, black holes, or the origin of time. It becomes about choice. Hawking did not choose his diagnosis. He chose what to do after it. He chose to work on problems that would outlast him. He chose to remain useful when usefulness became difficult. He chose to stay mentally alive when the body demanded surrender. There is no romance in that choice. It is repetitive. It is exhausting. It requires adjustment after adjustment, year after year. But it is also what turned a 2-year prognosis into more than 50 years of contribution. The lesson is not that suffering makes people great. It doesn't. The lesson is that limits force clarity. They strip away distractions and leave only what truly matters. When everything is taken, what you protect reveals who you are. Stephen Hawking protected his thinking. Not because it was easy. Not because it was inspiring. But because it was the last place he still had freedom. So the question isn't how much time you have. Or what you've lost. It's what you decide to keep working on anyway. So what's your story?